Tonight I'm going to tell you a love story, and it's also a story about death, and about mourning, and about public memory. And the story of these two people, this is Frankie Wadhams, who's from Wadhams, New York, and her husband, George Davenport. This is their wedding photograph from August 2nd, 1860. You can see she has a ring on. They lived in Brandon, Vermont after they were married, and in 1861, George decided he had to join the Army. She wasn't very happy about it. He was one of about 320 men from Brandon to join the Army. The town had a population of 3,000 in 1860. Here they are in front of the Congregational Church, about to walk down a few blocks to the train station to take them off to the war. She decided to join him, and she joined him in Camp Griffin, Virginia that winter. And when the spring came and the campaigning season started, they had to stop the war and the Civil War for the winter because the roads were so bad. She went to Washington, and she lived in a little culture of officers' wives in Washington. And then when the Army returned to camp, she went back to camp. And she lived that way for the first couple of years of the war. He was in the 5th Regiment, the Vermont Volunteers. He signed up again, re-enlisted in 1862, December of 1862, and fought through the war. 5th Regiment saw a lot of action in the Civil War, in the Peninsula Campaign, Gettysburg, Fredericksburg, and then in the Overland Campaign in 1864. And this is a map, for those of you who don't know what the Overland Campaign is, of what they were doing. General Grant decided to push forward across the entire South that year, and he decided that he would never return north, no matter how many men died, no matter how tough the battles were, and the battles were very, very tough. You can see the topography, the many rivers in the way. And on May 4th, 1864, they crossed the first of those rivers, the Rapidan, and the Union Army was heading south, and you can see that the bottom red there, A.P. Hill, was about to cut off the Army and possibly cut it in two and isolate General Hancock over there. And they sent the Vermonters down to the intersection of the Plank Road and the Brock Road to prevent that. And on the afternoon of May 5th, 1864, that's where the Vermont Brigade fought, and it was the toughest fighting of the war for the Vermont Brigade, and among the toughest fighting of the war anywhere. George was shot in the head. He was a captain by that point. He didn't recover. He died a week later. This is an image of Union soldiers near that intersection pulling somebody who's wounded out in a blanket between two rifles. The woods caught on fire, and the casualties were horrendous. About 2,800 Vermonters went into the wilderness, and you see in the next slide that 1,234 of them were casualties. It's the worst 2 days in Vermont's history. And when news came back, took a few days to trickle back, that's when the mourning started. And Frankie eventually got a letter about 6 weeks later about what had happened to George. She was home by that point. Oh, this is a slide of burial on the battlefield. This is at the Wilderness. George was buried on the field. George was not buried in a coffin. They didn't have many. He was wrapped in a blanket. His name was written on a cigar box, and that's the best they could do. Frankie got a letter about that from a Pennsylvania hospital steward. She was home then at her parents' house in Wadhams. And there she stayed for the next year. Her father died that year. And she stayed with her mother, and she wondered what had happened to George, and she wanted to find his body, but Northern Virginia was too dangerous to visit, and there was nothing she could do about it. The best thing she could do was keep in contact with the hospital steward, and she did. In May of 1865, the war ended. April of 65, the war ended. And in May, there was a victory parade, and she saw that as her only chance to find the man who knew where her husband was. So she went down to Washington. There were 120,000 soldiers in the city, and she found him. And then she got permission for him to go with her to find the body. And then she got the Vermont Brigade to help her. She took a ferry down the Potomac River and eventually got to Fredericksburg, which is not on the Potomac River, but she got close. Fredericksburg's cut off. You can see that the bridges are destroyed into the city. There was a battle there in December of 1862. And there she found the Vermont Brigade, and she got some help to go find the body. And she found it. This is where he was buried. She wrote to her brother, who was in the Naval Academy, "Oh, my dear brother, you can never imagine so dreary a place as where my dear husband was lying." They recognized the body from its beard and from the buttons of his shirt, which she had made. So they picked it up and they brought it back to Vermont. And there's Brandon in 1867. They put his body and the body of another soldier they found in the town hall, which was new then, and kept it there overnight, and the next day had a funeral about it. This is where they buried him. We buried my poor darling in a lovely spot in the cemetery in Brandon. Oh, you've no idea how relieved I feel to know where he was lying, instead of living as I have in the year past, not knowing anything about him. How I would give so much if I could live near his grave, where I could visit it every day and carry flowers. She did move near his grave. She lived until 1914, and she participated in Memorial Day until she couldn't. In 1886, the town built a monument to the 53 dead from that one town. So there are many families in Brandon mourning like Frankie. And in the 1880s, when they built this monument, it was a veterans occasion, but it's been a children's occasion since 1902. Since 1902, the first grade girls in Brandon, all wearing white dresses, have dropped flowers around the monument. It's an incredibly beautiful ceremony and also an incredibly Victorian one. That's Stella Andrews, who was in first grade in 2012. And here Stella is with her mother, who wore the same dress in 1981, and her grandmother, who made the dress. Her younger sister, Eva, will wear it this year. And that's the story in Brandon. We had a parade for Memorial Day this year, and we had flower girls as old as their 70s show up for that. It was a flower girl reunion. For at least 115 years, it's been an unbroken tradition in Brandon. And it's all still there. The church, the town hall, the building where the GAR met, the veterans until the 1930s, the graves they went to, the monument they built. We're so lucky in Vermont to have this heritage. And the final thing I want to say to you is when we think of the history of the Civil War, or any war, we need to think about the history of mourning. Thank you.